I think that's a crucial point, that the reason an altered state is valuable is, we're usually going around just kind of operating reflexively, feeling like an integrated single person. But then in this kind of altered state, suddenly there's this kind of very inclusive, accepting quality to the MDMA of kind of allowing everything, not being hijacked by shame or wanting to kind of reject parts of yourself. And then in this kind of spaciousness of just, you have the kind of awareness of your mind, of consciousness, and then within it, there are parts arising, reactions, and then you can suddenly, so for me, to give an example, there's, from having to kind of grow up too quickly, there's kind of parts that are kind of toddler-like, that are like, have been rejected. And so it almost became like, almost hearing a voice in my head of a toddler having a tantrum. And in normal consciousness, that sounds like an odd thing to say and not something you'd want to kind of own. And so you say, so just unconsciously, you're like, that's a part that I reject. But then suddenly being able to kind of lovingly see it and go, okay, there is some part of me that doesn't want to be the grown-up, doesn't want to just get on with life. There's some part of me that wants to have a strong reaction. And then if you can just kind of see that in awareness, then suddenly it's like, okay, and then it has its reaction and then you move on, right? And instead of people being kind of unconsciously hijacked, as we said before, by these things that are going on under the surface.
Yeah, exactly. And in the exploration of it, we realize what those parts hold and also what they protect us from. That we do have parts, if we're talking about like internal family systems theory, we do have parts that then have jobs and hold this particular, I need to protect you from this feeling. So this is the way I protect you, right? I throw a temper tantrum, I protect you, or I do this, or I withdraw, or I close doors. So in the exploration, when we don't reject them and do accept them and we do invite them in, then we understand them. So instead of them being one-dimensional, they become three-dimensional. They become an actual part of ourselves. And it's like, it's a part that holds all these different things, that holds fear, or that holds this, that maybe younger part has always held the fear, and so, or the pain. And so we say, I want to go to there because that part just holds pain. It's just pain. But once you look at it, it holds more than pain, right? There is then the discovery of creativity of other parts, that maybe that part also holds this amazing creativity or amazing imagination that we have also warded off, that in our attempt to not look at the painful part, we have also warded off and prevented us from enjoying our own resource of other parts of ourselves that are very creative, right? So I don't believe that one part holds just one thing. And if it becomes three-dimensional and it becomes more of a person, then we understand those other parts too. It's more complex. It's more complex than just one-dimensional.
And you kind of pointed to, again, the idea that you can discover that the kind of trauma response can actually, rather than being people going and feeling they're broken in some way, they have some disorder, they can actually see that these are kind of quite wise coping mechanisms, and be quite thankful to those coping responses.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of the healing. It's so beautiful when somebody can say, wow, like this part that I've hated, it's just protected me all this time. And I'm so thankful for it. It's so painful, right? It's so painful sometimes to see that how mean we can be to parts of ourselves and how devastating that it can be. And I think part of the think about the pain that can happen in this process, it's not just pain coming from the trauma and coming from the feelings of the trauma, but also from the way we've kept ourselves from living a life that we've wanted. And that can be so sad and devastating too. And then also so exciting, right? Like now I get to be curious. I get to, for myself, I think one of the biggest healings for me was that I became curious of other people. I had room for exploration of sensations and of being in connection to people, and had curiosity about people's states, so it was like, it was a shift from, the only time that I could do school, like people say, well, how could you go to school? How could you go to college? How could you do all these things? It's like, you can do those things. You can use your mind cognitively, right? And stop curiosity of another kind. And so you're just being able to study, to learn, to know, to read. All those parts can be very active. And then there's this part that is like a child, has never been able to develop that sense of curiosity.
Right. And you mentioned early on this kind of distinction between PTSD that comes from a kind of single acute overwhelming event versus what might be called complex PTSD, or, during development, if you're living in a kind of chronically stressful situation, your way of being becomes kind of traumatized in some way. And I feel like the things we're talking about seem to apply very well, maybe to the complex PTSD. I'm sure they also apply to the acute case. But do you think this
Yes,
these tools
absolutely.
allow people to come out of that way of being?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful for definitely for treatment resistant. And, I'm not saying that I don't believe that just one event cannot cause the same kind of identity, right? Like, it just depends on how long we've lived with it, and how our coping strategies are, and what even came before it, right? Like, I think it's not in isolation. It's like, if we were raised in this particular way where everything was very safe, and there was a sense of self-worth and love and compassion, then it's going to be easier to deal with maybe trauma that happens, right? And so it's how do we, what is it that is affecting us? What is the trauma affecting? And so that is, I think, more important. And so, yes, complex PTSD, because it's more difficult to treat, but that the most important part is, what are all the systems that happened? What are the conditions that happened to get us to the particular place that we're in? And it could have been just one particular trauma that led us there, but because of all the circumstances on our lives around us. So it's more, I think, that identity that we have, that identity that can be so difficult to shift, because it's also, many times we've had participants that will say, oh, wow, like, as they begin to shift and healing begins to happen, they'll say, who am I without PTSD? I have no idea who I am without PTSD. And that is really scary. It's very scary to not know all of a sudden, and to say, oh, my coping strategies don't work anymore, or I don't want them because of the price tag attached to them. And who am I now? And how do I function in the world? And I think that's the work that happens after. That's the work that we continue to do after the treatment of, how do I integrate this into my life? And how do I give myself time to discover who I am and discover how I want to be in the world without PTSD?